So my last post is something I'd really like to talk more about because I think it's something that I think it gets lost a lot in modern jiu-jitsu where people don't talk about this like underlying philosophical concept, which I think is like very deeply embedded into like the essence of what jiu-jitsu, or at least like modern Brazilian jiu-jitsu, originally was intended to be, and I think in many ways still is. Right? Like how often do we hear this idea that, like Henzo once said this, right? That jujitsu takes the weak and makes them strong. Well, like, how does it do that, right? What is the mechanism by which it does that, right? Is it magic? No, there's a specific way in which it's doing that, and a specific sort of like philosophical position that jujitsu sort of always occupied in terms of combat sports. And I think there's a lot of like really interesting things we can analyze about that sort of underlying philosophical position that Gracie Jiu-Jitsu and modern Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu like holds, and like psychology and like how this can inform us as to like different approaches to life in general, right? Like I think like if you look at the life of Elio Gracie specifically and his sort of underlying like worldview, there's something very interesting about that, which connects to the the underlying philosophy of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. So, for instance, I think it's very notable that modern Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu is pretty much the only martial art, the only grappling art in the world that at least that I know of, that places a really heavy emphasis on the guard position, right? Like the majority of grappling arts center themselves around takedowns. And a takedown is primarily an offensive technique, right? So most grappling arts are centered primarily around offense, okay? Whereas jiu-jitsu, I would argue the heart of jiu-jitsu is the guard position and passing the guard, right? So this is like the core of our art, and I would argue that at the heart of both the guard position and the guard, like the guy passing the guard, I would actually argue defense is at the center of both of these positions, not offense. Now, there's a lot that can be said about this. I'd actually rather talk about it on a podcast than just like in my stories, because this is a very broad topic. But another interesting thing that I think that we can analyze in light of this sort of a discussion is the way rule sets either do or don't align with that sort of like underlying value structure of jiu-jitsu, right? So for instance, I would argue that the core of success in ADCC, it's definitely offense, right? Defense is of course crucial, but offense is first and foremost the most important thing in ADCC. I'd say, sub only, depending on the rule set, that's also going to change a lot too. So it's interesting in, like, when we look at ADCC, people talk about how it's not a jiu-jitsu tournament, right? It's a submission wrestling tournament. And I think that that's actually true, but not in the way maybe people think it is. I think it's true more so in the fact that the rule set, it encourages something very different from what jiu-jitsu at its core is ultimately like encouraging us to do, right? Jiu-jitsu encourages us first and foremost to prioritize defense and survival over and above everything else. Whereas ADCC, the rules first and foremost encourage offense, which is much more in line with pretty much all the other grappling arts out there. Now, of course, jiu-jitsu guys have the most success overall because jiu-jitsu overall is the most complete grappling art, and also because the ADCC point structure like very closely resembles the jiu-jitsu point structure. But the fact still stands that ADCC is something pretty distinct from jiu-jitsu. So another like direction we can take this is, I think it's really interesting to look at different like ways people envision what they should be doing with their lives, right? Like settling versus being aggressive, ambitious about like getting more things, right? That we can look at how like people operate in this fashion, but also societies, even countries, right? There's certain countries which are very happy to sort of stay safe against threats, right? But then there are other countries which are very ambitious and want to go out there and do things, right? Maybe like take things, right? And it's interesting to think about that in terms of like the values that people or countries have, and like sustainability, like what can we sustain over long periods of time, right? Like things like that. These sorts of like conversations about values, like, and like that's ultimately gonna inform like what our actions should be, right? Like what sorts of things we should go out there and do, right? Like if I think that first and foremost survival is the most important thing, that my actions are going to reflect that. If I'm more ambitious and aggressive in terms of my worldview, then my actions are going to reflect that. And we can have a conversation about like, is there a best way to live your life? I'm not sure that there is. I'm pretty skeptical of that idea, but I do think that there are certain advantages and disadvantages of the various different like ways we can envision living our life in terms of like, you know, risk versus reward and defense versus offense. So this was like a pretty central part of why I think I felt so enamored by the country of Singapore when I first went there. I remember talking to a friend of mine in Singapore who is Singaporean, and he said Singapore is kind of like a safe bubble where nothing bad really ever happens, but nothing amazing really ever happens either. And I was like, actually sounds kind of nice. Like, I think I like that. I am someone who, first and foremost, I feel like I'm pretty risk averse. Now, it's funny, if you look at my life, I've actually taken a lot of like very risky choices. For instance, like pursuing Jiu Jitsu full time, I think is a very risky choice. But like, I don't know, I still think at heart I'm a pretty risk averse person. I think that I am more interested in defense than I am in offense. I'm more interested in surviving than I am in like, you know, attacking. And my ideal would be to have a lifestyle, to have even like a grappling style which reflects that, where first and foremost I concern myself with survival, right, mitigating risk, and then after that's accomplished I can move towards, you know, like taking some risks to accomplish things that I want to accomplish, right? But before that I always want to prioritize survival. And I don't think that that's inherently the best way to live your life. I just think it's a certain way that we can live our life which has certain advantages to it, right? And I think that was, I saw that reflected in Singapore. And I mean, maybe it is, maybe it isn't. Maybe I was just projecting, but that was a part of like why I felt so enamored by the country. I was talking to a friend of mine the other day about like what is the most moral possible society, and I think an argument could be made perhaps for Switzerland, right? A Swiss style culture and society where like, I'm not like an expert on Switzerland. I know a little bit about the history, and it seems to me one of the core values of Swiss culture historically has been this idea of just like wanting to be left alone, right? Like leave us alone, let us live our lives, don't fuck with us, right? I kind of love that. This is something that like Americans like to tell ourselves is a deep part of our culture, like the don't tread on me thing, and I really like that a lot. But the trick is that like, if you know anything about American culture, especially in terms of like how we've influenced Latin America or, you know, many other parts of the world, it's not really how we are. But that core ideal, I really like that a lot. This idea of leave us alone, let us do our own thing. And I think core to that is survival, defense, right? If you want to be left alone, if you want to do your own thing, first and foremost, you've got to be capable of defending yourself, right? And isn't this like always what we're told the martial arts are fundamentally about? Self-defense, right? It's not necessarily about going out there and taking what someone else has, but it's about being capable of keeping what you have, right? Defending what's yours rather than going out there and taking what's theirs. And another thing to talk about this is how like psychology plays a role in this, right? Like the circumstances of our life and probably also to some degree our genetics are going to influence what we see as more attractive, right? Defense versus offense. So if you've ever seen me without a shirt on, and maybe you didn't notice this, you probably didn't actually, I don't have a regular belly button because when I was a little kid, I had some kind of surgery. I think I had like severe health complications. And I've often wondered the extent to which that has informed and influenced my overall worldview, right? Like, where as a young kid I had like some like serious health complications which required surgery. Maybe that's played on my psychology in like really deep underlying ways.